My name's Ricardo Spagni, Fluffy Pony, that you may know, or you may know me as Fluffy Pony anyway, and I'm here to talk about Monero. Okay. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need financial privacy, what Monero is and does, Monero's birth and growth, and how we're trying to make Monero useful and usable. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm probably going to waffle in one of the sections and go really fast in the rest. So why we need financial privacy? Because it's, all about like tax evasion and drugs, right? The thing is, cash is a really interesting product or interesting tool that we use because cash is fungible and private in the best possible way. It only relies on your operational security. If you have a bunch of cash, no one can come to you and just figure out how much cash you've got. They normally have to ask you, and you have to go lift up your mattress and show them. And also, cash, the amount of cash can be revealed by the owner, and so can the transaction. So if you pay somebody in cash, only you know that you paid them, and well, they know that you paid them too, but no one can see that you paid them unless they've directly observed the transaction. And the thing is, privacy isn't just for criminals, although that seems to be a common misconception. The reason why we might want financial privacy is we want to avoid things like targeted advertising. Do I really want to see adverts in my browser because yesterday I bought something on an entirely different site? What about unintended leaking of sorted purchases? Do I really want all the people at the office knowing what I buy? Well, I certainly don't. There's also minor censorship, which is something that is quite specific to cryptocurrencies. Do we want miners to be able to censor transactions based on the fact that I'm spamming the chain or gambling or doing some other degenerate activity? And then also, a lack of financial privacy is bad for businesses because it can leak things like salaries, profits, and revenue. So we can accept that we need financial privacy, or at least we want it. It's desirable. So Monero is an attempt to provide financial privacy, good financial privacy, strong financial privacy. And the way it works is we take a look, or we target 4 different avenues of financial privacy or transactional privacy. We use this thing called dual key stealth addressing to try and obscure who we're paying, so where the transaction is going to. Then we use ring signatures to obscure where the transaction is coming from, so who's paying the money. Then we use something called ring confidential transactions to obscure the amount. And lastly, we use something called covery to hide the actual IP address where transactions originate from. So to go over this very briefly and without getting into massive amounts of technical detail, with outgoing transactions, and if you're familiar with Bitcoin and how Bitcoin transactions work, you can see on the blockchain the address that's being paid to. Now with Monero, it's kind of different because the address that it's being paid to is not really an address. It's this little computation that gets done. It gets hashed with a random. And so it looks like it's getting paid to some random destination. And so what that means is if you've got a transaction with multiple outputs, 3 of them might be going back to you as change, and 3 of them might be going to somebody else. And there's no way of telling because they seem to be going to 6 different destinations. And these aren't like addresses in Bitcoin where they get repeated later on or get reused. These are unique because the random value that you pick is typically unique. And then we use something called ring signatures to make sure that they're cryptographically untraceable. And so what that means is you have a copy of the blockchain, and when you're creating your transaction, instead of it coming from an old transaction that you've received, it appears to come from multiple old transactions. So you go take the blockchain, and you take a look at a whole bunch of old transactions, and you create this ring signature without the other people being involved, so you can do it completely offline. And obviously one of those is your real signature. And we use this little thing called a key image to identify that, but there's no way to reverse it. And so when you look at a transaction, it appears to come from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, however many old transactions, and an attacker can't identify which of those, or ostensibly can't identify which of those is the real signer. Now, this obviously is quite a powerful mechanism, but we try to make it more powerful by using something called ring CT, which is based on the confidential transactions that Blockstream created. And ring CT basically uses something called commitments. And in the destination, instead of paying a value, we pay a commitment. And a commitment is this clever little cryptographic trick where you basically use a hash of a number instead of the actual number. And the really cool thing about it is you can do arithmetic, which is largely irrelevant to anyone except somebody that's checking the protocol. And then we do the same thing on the input. Our ring signature then signs the arithmetic between these commitments. And the net effect to anyone that's using it is that you can't figure out the amount that's being transacted, which is, of course, really powerful because you could be moving $1 in a transaction or $100 million and no one would know. And so the net effect is that we have this really powerful cryptographically valueless, and that doesn't mean it's valueless in other ways, but this cryptographically valueless mechanism. The problem is that whilst this privacy is extremely strong, the weakest part of this is where we're choosing the older outputs across the blockchain that we want to mix with. And so this is where we talk about Monero having strong privacy. This is probably the weakest part of Monero's privacy, because choosing those outputs is a really difficult exercise. And it's an ongoing exercise. It's an arms race, because you're going to have companies that have got access to big data and that have got clever ways of analyzing the data, and they're going to be able to make really good, educated guesses as to which of these is the real one in the transaction graph. And so there are multiple weaknesses that were discussed by disclosed and discussed by the Monero Research Lab in 2014 and 2015. More recently, a tool was built that allowed you to analyze some of the older Monero transactions and see the linkability or the traceability in them. Ring confidential transactions changes this because the linkability, there's a much broader anonymity set, and so it makes it much more difficult to crunch this data. But this is an ongoing exercise. There's more work that's required, and it's a continuous arms race against people trying to figure it out and us who are trying to protect our users. And then, of course, we've got the aspect of being passively hidden. So we want to protect our users against passive surveillance. So typically in a decentralized network like Monero's, when you broadcast a transaction, it gets flood-filled through the network. So your node sends it to the nodes that it's connected to, who send it to the nodes that they're connected to. Now, what an attacker can do is run a bunch of naughty nodes and then figure out, like, oh, that's the IP address that the transaction originated from. That's obviously bad. So we have a project called Kovri, which is an I2P router, and I2P is a hidden services network like Tor. And Kovri is still in sort of pre-alpha stage, although it works fairly well, but we're getting there. And when Kovri is fully integrated into Monero, then transactions will flow over I2P instead of flowing over the normal internet. And the net effect, again, is that the originating IP address will be hidden, and all that an attacker will be able to see is the I2P address, which has no correlation, as long as we're clever, has no correlation with your nodes or your wallet's real IP address. Now, one of the major aspects to Monero, and why we have some privacy aspects of Monero that are really strong and some that are really weak, is because Monero has mandatory privacy. So mandatory privacy is important because if you didn't have mandatory privacy, you can imagine a blockchain-based system where you have a magical cloud of privacy, but only 1,000 users are using it. So when you move transactions in and out of the magical cloud of privacy, what happens is your anonymity set is restricted at best to the people that are using that magical cloud of privacy, and everyone else remains unprotected, or at least you're not mixing with them. And so you end up sticking out like a sore thumb. And this is, of course, bad. When it comes to evaluating privacy technologies as well, and this doesn't just go for financial privacy, this goes for privacy technologies in general, what you want to do is think a lot about the ideology, because ideology matters. Why are people building things, and what are they building them for? So with Monero, we know, and Monero is not the best example necessarily, but at least we have some ideology, and that is that Monero contributors know that at the very least, we are responsible for people's money. It doesn't matter how many times I tell people not to buy Monero or to go and do research on it, they're going to buy it anyway, and so we're responsible for that. We also know that people are going to be crazy and they're going to sell their house and put their life savings into Monero, so we might be responsible for that too. And that's kind of like disconcerting as it is. But more than that, we know that because we're a pro-privacy technology, people might be reliant on the privacy enhancements to stay out of prison. And so the code we write might literally mean the difference between someone going to prison or not. And in a very, very hostile adversarial environment, or in a country that is very oppressive, we might actually end up being responsible for someone's life or death. And so we take the stuff that we do very seriously. And that is why ideology matters. In fact, I would argue that any privacy-enhancing technology that treats their users with less care, or treats the technology with less care, is not only being incredibly irresponsible, but they're indistinguishable from a scam. Now, Monero's growth over the past few years has been pretty interesting, especially from an open source perspective. We've seen a massive increase in the number of commits per month. We've seen a massive increase in the number of contributors that have come on board per month. And these are people who are unpaid. They just want to hack away at the Monero source because they think it's cool. We've also seen a massive increase in transactional growth, especially over the past sort of 12 months or so. And one might think that maybe this transactional growth exists because of speculators, but we're seeing not just speculators, but actual users come on board and be interested in the system and its inner workings. And we see this in things like the community growth. So sustained subreddit subscriber growth, which is quite an interesting metric for us to see. People who are not only interested in the ecosystem, but in the protocol, people that are actually visiting the subreddit on a daily basis, but not necessarily subscribing to it. And we're just seeing an increase in this over time, a massive increase in this, which is really, really massively rewarding. But of course, right now, Monero is kind of really painful to use. We want to make Monero more useful and usable. And the way we're doing this, or one of the things that we've been working on, is the core Monero GUI. We released the beta 1 towards the end of last year, and then beta 2 was we released about a month ago. And it's really cool. It's a completely sort of different approach to a cryptocurrency wallet, because we actually started from scratch and said, people don't understand how the stuff works. Let's wireframe it and see if we can figure out how to make it a little bit more easy, a little bit more accessible, and a little bit more useful to newcomers. But more than that, there are other things that we want to do with Monero. We want Monero to be a pro-privacy layer to build things on top of. And so that's why there are a whole bunch of things that we're excited about and things that we're looking at and that we want to do. But as an unfunded open source project, I mean, I can tell you about all the things we want to do, but we'll probably never get to them. And that is why we need contributors. We need people who are willing to get involved. We need people who are interested in getting involved in the Monero source itself, which is not that complex. Well, I mean, it is complex, but there are aspects of it that are not that complex. And we merge any pull request. So within reason, as long as you're not introducing backdoors. Although we merge those two and then revert them later. And it's fun and exciting because there's an interesting group of developers. And if you're not interested in development, well, there's a whole bunch of other things. There's the Monero Research Lab. Go find a spelling error on a paper and get your name on a paper. That's cool. There's also non-technical projects like content for the website and so on. Hell, even the Wikipedia entry needs a lot of work. And then, of course, there's external projects in the ecosystem. So there's things like My Monero, which is a web-based wallet that's transitioning to apps. And all the apps are written in Java, or primarily written in JavaScript, and then there's a native iOS app. And these are all things that people can work on without needing to touch the core Monero code. So that's really Monero in a nutshell, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, and where we're going. I hope everyone found this terribly informative. And if you have any questions or you need to find out more information, get Monero.org. Thank you very much.